And we're live. Hello and welcome, everyone. It's time for another practical and insightful episode of IT Career in Australia channel. I know I've been away for a few weeks. You probably miss me. I hope I was away for a few weeks. That's fine too. But yes, today's topic is must watch for anyone trying to get into the government jobs. So we're going to talk how to nail government panel interviews in tech. With Ben. Obviously, a few of you probably know Ben. It's been a familiar face on this channel. So yes, another topic with Ben today. A lot of you know that government roles often involve really structured panel interviews, which can feel very different from private sector process. And in this session, Ben will share how to prepare for panel-style questions, present your experience with confidence, and align your answers to public sector values and selection criteria. So yeah, if you're applying for government tech roles, make sure to tune into the session because it's definitely few key differences that you need to think about. Bring your questions and also say hi in the comments. If you're not saying hi in the comments, it's kind of sad because then we don't know that you're here and listening to us. So make sure to say hi in the comments and let us know where you're watching us from. And as usual, I do encourage you, if you're watching me on YouTube, make sure to connect with me on LinkedIn, and vice versa. If you're watching us on LinkedIn, make sure to subscribe to YouTube channel. I also have a meetup group where I post all these online and face-to-face events, and a tech walking group that's getting more and more popular. We're going for a walk. This Sunday we had a walk in Albert Park with like over 60 people. There's a walk on the Sunshine Coast next week, and then Sydney as well. I'll be in Sydney in 2 weeks. So if you're in Sydney, please make sure to join me for a walk in Sydney as well. There's a lot of exciting stuff going on. And I guess without any further delays, I'm going to pass it on to Ben for a quick intro and obviously for today's discussion.
Yeah, thank you, Jana. Nice to be back talking to your audience on a subject that I'm really passionate about. My name's Ben. I'm a career coach. I've been a career coach for the past 10 years, mostly focused on the tech industry, but over the last few years, I've sort of shifted focus to government interviews, and I've racked up over 500 hours of coaching people in government panel interview techniques. I worked out the other day. My background's actually, before becoming a coach in 2016, I was in the tech industry for 20 years. I worked at Telstra for 11 years as a manager in the product development and engineering space, and worked for a New Zealand software startup prior to that. And looking forward to sharing some information about government panel interviews today and how you can prepare really well to really ace those interviews.
Perfect. Thank you, Ben. And quite a few people joining us. Jason from Sydney, Phil from Melbourne, Ramlal. Missed the walk. Make sure to come and run in August, the end of August walk coming up as well. Rahul's here. Thank you guys for saying hi. And make sure to say hi if you didn't, obviously, because we wanna interact with you and see your questions. Also, just a quick one. I know Ben probably going to mention it, but in this session, we're going to purely focus on the government interviews. So I know you probably have a lot of other questions as well, but let's just stick to this topic. If you want to know a bit more about the government tech market in general, so we did have a different session with Ben more broadly how to get a tech job in government in Australia. So I really recommend to go back to this one to maybe answer some of these questions, and make sure all your questions today is purely focused on that panel interviews. So Ben, I guess over to you for like a little presentation before we go to question and answers.
Great. Yeah, thanks, Jana. I'll try not to bore everyone to death with my PowerPoint slides, but This topic is about how to nail government interviews. So there is a bit of theory to cover on what questions you need to prep for, how to prep for those, and really the main value I think I can add to the audience is talking about some of the best practices, so you can really come out as one of the top candidates through this experience. Love to connect with you guys on LinkedIn, and I offer free consults to anyone through my profile. If you want to practice your interview answers with me, you can book one of those consults, and I'm very happy. Always love to meet new people and share some advice. So let's get into it. As Jana mentioned, we did do another session on earlier in the year, and that focused a lot about the differences between government, so public sector, and private sector. So if you're brand new and you've never done a panel interview, that's a really good one to check out. We also talked about state government versus federal government, the APS. So we went into quite a bit of detail there. I'm going to cover a few of those points today, but I don't want to repeat some of that content, but recommend to check that out. So first of all, how to be well prepared. And I know 10 to 12 hours sounds like a lot of time, but I really would recommend, if you have a shot at this, they're so competitive, these roles, if you have a shot, really give it your all. 10 to 12 hours is really the sort of investment of time that you need to make to be really well prepared. It gets easier, and if you're doing multiple interviews, you don't need to repeat a lot of that practice. A lot of that's foundation work. What takes a lot of time is getting stories ready. So if you guys have had any exposure to this already, you probably know about star stories and having a great library of stories. So I recommend 6 to 8, and that's eating up a lot of those 10 to 12 hours there. Researching the employer. So obviously a lot of these things I'm going to share today applies equally to private sector, right? There's a lot of overlap. In fact, I'm going to talk about the overlap in a second. So a lot of this is like not new amazing tips just for government. On the mock interview, one of the things I would recommend, and you're probably going to say, of course, Ben, you would say that, you're an interview coach, but getting coaching from someone or doing a mock interview with someone who has been a panel member or who knows how these interviews are structured, or a coach like me, is really valuable. People get all sorts of, like, you can practice some parts with family and friends and maybe a colleague, but you're not going to get that really tailored and specific advice to that government panel interview scenario from people who don't really know what they're talking about, to be frank. So just practice is great, but be careful who you're taking advice and feedback from. Certainly if you're in government already, getting your manager or someone you're friendly with at work who's sat on a panel to give you feedback is a great idea. So as mentioned, there's quite a bit more of like what to expect in this structure.
I have a question here. Then you're saying like you need to get, ideally talk with someone who's been in the panel. Is it true that people who interviewing in this panel interviews, they have like that crazy papers to fill with checking the boxes and the different criteria, and actually being the interview in the panel interview is quite a painful process as much as being interviewed by the panel?
Yeah, well, one of the differences is it's highly structured, and it would actually be great if private sector was a little bit more like this in a way, right? So each question has a ranking, and it's not, in the federal government at least, it's out of 5, 5 is a top mark and 3 is a pass. So 3 is suitable, and you want to aim obviously to at least get a pass mark. So yeah, there's a highly structured process sitting behind that with the panel members. There's usually a scribe there, and often that scribe will facilitate that scoring process. It's very rigorous like that for reasons of transparency and fairness. So often when you attend an interview, what you actually see is the top of people's head, because they're actually just furiously writing down notes and scoring you and ticking things off as they go. So it's often quite impersonal because they're deep in the weeds. I hope that answered the question.
Yeah, that makes sense.
So highly recommend the previous talk if you're brand new to panel interviews, if you haven't had one before, watch that. But yeah, they're highly structured, standard set of questions. It's less interactional, as I was just saying. And more often than not, one interview, you'll sometimes get a 25-minute interview, and that's it. And it's a very, very long process usually. So the processes are really extended in public sector recruiting. Like literally one client of mine waited 6 months from a successful interview to an offer, just to give you some sort of baseline there.
You almost need to look for another job in between while you're waiting for a government job.
Yeah. You could definitely take a short-term contract. So actually that brings me to a good point. Like if you are unemployed, and sure, pursuing a role in government is a great idea. Why not? It's good stability, lots of other good reasons, but it's not a quick path to get a role, and it wouldn't be my only strategy, right? So if you really need to find paid work, the government is not going to respond quickly. So just be aware of that. Types of questions to prep for, and again, there's heaps of overlap here between private sector and public sector. Star story questions. Tell me about a time when. Can you describe a situation? And this represents most questions you'll get in panel interviews. I would say probably 80% are questions of this nature, because they want you to provide evidence that you meet the criteria. And I know that might sound obvious, but if they have to score you on that scorecard out of 5 possible points, you need to provide evidence with a story, and we'll talk a bit more about that. The other questions which are more that do come up is, describe your approach to, describe your leadership style, or describe your experience with something, right? And that sort of goes to your core skill or profession, like change management, architecture, development, whatever it is, right? And that's the more typical style of private sector question, but it does come up. Pitch questions. I call these pitch questions. Tell us about yourself. Why are you interested in working for us? What are your top strengths as a candidate? We're actually going to jump into some of those, and I'll give you some recommendations. And of course, questions for the panel. This looked better in my head than when I did this on the PowerPoint slide, I have to say, but I hope it comes across. The point I was trying to make, only this should be probably a lot skinnier. The preparation that you do for private sector and public sector interviews is really not any different. So you've got to have great stories. You've got those pitch type questions. You practice some research. You understand the job description. There's not much difference, really. So those circles could be a lot more overlapping, but I didn't have room for the text. One of the differences in public sector is there's a capability framework or behavioral indicators. And that's kind of like the judge's scorecard. And that's something that you can reference to sort of polish your answers. But really, that's a polishing part, which is finesse, the sort of 10% part. You have to have the foundations right first. Private sector, you would get questions about your resume. So you won't get that in public sector. They're not going to ask, oh, hey, Jana, I saw you did this project last year. Tell me a bit more about that. You don't get those bespoke questions because they have to have a standard set to ask everyone. When you're prepping for private sector too, you want to know the panel members, right? You want to know, oh yeah, I know what Jana does, so I can ask her some intelligent questions. I know how long she's been with the company. But again, we don't get so much opportunity to do things like that. Where it really gets different and diverges more is the delivery style. And a really key takeaway is in the private sector interviews, I would always recommend don't talk for longer than 2 minutes. You're usually talking too long, you're rambling, and you should stop and say, oh, hey, does that answer your question? Or would you like me to go into a bit more detail? And that's a good practice sort of fundamental. If you're talking for more than 2 minutes for an answer, think about how to break it down, right? But yeah, it's more conversational, it's more rapport based. The things that are common, I think,
especially in Australia, I think in the private sector, majority of interviews quite conversational. People don't expect you just giving like answers to your question. They do want to have this interaction and conversation and make sure you ask the questions back and things like that. So I think it's quite obvious that in Australia it's more conversational interviews in the private sector.
Yeah, absolutely. And those are the best ones. When you actually sit down and you're able to have a conversation, that's where you're building rapport and trust, and that they tend to deliver the best results. Whereas the difference really in delivery style is that you're giving longer, detailed answers, and they have to be aligned to the capabilities. And hey, a big one, guys, notes are okay. So you can refer to notes even in an in-person interview. It's perfectly fine. In fact, a client of mine had an interview last week, and they actually even said that at the beginning of the interview. If you want to refer to notes, it's totally fine. If you prefer to do that during the interview. Okay, so.
Especially if people who are interviewing you looking at their notes.
Yeah, exactly. We're all yeah. Okay, so first question, tell me about yourself. And actually all of this could apply to private sector as well. So here are some building blocks, and I won't go through all of these, otherwise we'll be here for 2 hours and we'll probably lose all the audience. But I wanted to write a few tips here if you're actually going to take away some of this advice and apply it. And again, very, very open to you can book a consult with me and try this out. I'll give you some feedback. But these are the building blocks of that kind of opening question. You usually get this, but not always. Sometimes in the public sector, they literally just jump straight into a detailed question. There's no kind of opener, especially if it's only 20 minutes long, right? So you don't always get this. But having this professional value proposition, I am a senior business analyst with 15 years of experience working in the telco and insurance space. I'm a certified Scrum practitioner, blah, blah, blah. So having this is actually something you can rehearse and kind of, I'll talk about scripts in a second, but I wouldn't ever script this out completely. But you can practice and practice and practice this until it's really natural and fluid. And sometimes you might talk about your situation, particularly if you haven't moved, if you haven't worked in the private public sector before, right? Talk about that. Why are you targeting that role? That requires some explanation. And talking about your top strengths as well. So this is a really good thing to practice as well. It's a building block, right? What would I consider my top strengths are? And if I'm going for a business analysis role, it might be attention to detail, managing requirements, understanding complex IT systems, and collaboration. Don't try to run off a whole huge laundry list of skills. Stick to your top 3 and align those to the job description. Being likable is one of the, as much as there is a structured scoring system, and you could be the most likable person in the world and still fail, to answer the questions. But likability is really important. And one of the things I think is often overlooked is that 30 seconds of you opening your mouth or even sitting down, a lot of connection is made with panel members. So you want to show that enthusiasm. Thanks so much for the opportunity, Jana, to come in and talk to you today about this opportunity. I'm really excited to be here. Thanks, Jana. And I'll thank Steve as well, too, for your time. Nice energy, smile, happy to be there, even if you're feeling nervous as hell inside. But you can practice this, and you want to practice that opener just to get off on the right foot. So these panels have a really hard time. They have these back-to-back meetings all day, and when you jump into one of those interviews, I've been in this situation myself, and in the first 30 seconds, the person's got nice energy, their style of speech is engaging, they look happy, thank goodness this is going to be an easy one, this is going to be enjoyable. So answering the question, I know it seems like such an obvious thing to say, but please answer the question. So One of the things that's really important is you often get questions, a copy of the questions before the interview, which is awesome. But if you don't get that, when you get a question, make sure you're writing it down, or writing down a couple of like, what exactly is the question? Because they might not say, tell me about yourself. They might say, tell us a little bit about yourself and your testing experience, especially with Scrum teams, and you've got to get all those elements. So this is where you need these building blocks, but you've got to have flexibility, right? Answer the question. Why are you interested in this role? This is actually a really big one that people often overlook and get wrong. You can have these great star stories and you come across as really professional, but if you show zero motivation for the actual role, like it's just about the money, I just want to get up one level, how's the hiring manager going to get excited about you, right? They still want someone who's got some passion, right? So here are some things you can think about, but most of all, no BS, please. Don't just copy and paste from the job description where it says, I really care deeply about being part of an innovative and thoughtful, driven, inclusive culture. Don't just copy and paste stuff. Like, only say things you really mean. And look, maybe you're going for a job at the ATO to do with income tax or something like that, and it's a bit hard to get excited about that role. So don't say things you don't mean. But say, look, one of the lines I really like is, look, when I read this job description, I got really excited because, look, it just matches my strengths exactly, So if you can't say anything nice about the department, but look, there's usually a lot to talk about, right? There's projects, there's policy areas, there's services. I'd love to be part of the ATO with the services that reach like the entire Australian population, But yeah, you can talk about, this is where your research comes into play too. So make it meaningful, like mention things that are on their roadmap or priorities.
I mean, ATO maybe not the most exciting one, but they do solve quite complicated problems. And you can always relate it back to your role in this and helping to solve those problems.
ATO have got a lot of good data science and analytics work, and they've got a lot of internal systems, a lot of IT, let's say. They're one of the top departments that can have a lot of actually quite good IT jobs. And the scale of some of those systems are obviously pretty impressive, right? I won't spend too much time on this, but you should be prepared for the question, hey, what are your top strengths? Another way to put that would be, why are you an ideal candidate for this role? And you want to, again, don't go overboard, just pick your top three, but you really want to show evidence. So I'd say one of my top strengths as a candidate is my collaboration skills. This has been shown over the last 7 years in my roles at Telstra and the Department of Health, where I've been a Scrum Master and a lead BA working with teams of up to 30 people. Something like that. So when you talk about your strengths, don't just say, oh, I'm really good at collaboration. One of my strengths is I'm a really empathetic leader. Well, that's kind of just fluff unless you connect that with some evidence. So that's really important. So we want our strengths to marry up to the job description, and we want to show a little bit of some facts or substance behind that. So you can use that value proposition framework, which is a method that's very effective. So just building those, what are my credentials when it comes to safe or developing in React, whatever it is, right? So you can pick individual topics and build a statement there. Star stories. So those are some common questions to prepare for. If you were in a super hurry and you had an interview in the next 24 hours or something like that, I would say prep for those 3 questions and get 2 to 4 stories ready, and you're pretty well prepared. So elements of a good star story are 70% action. So 70% of the time you're talking about what I did, and it's the I action verb statement. I investigated, I completed, I led, I developed. And a lot of those verbs can come out of the job description. So you can get some inspiration there. Strong finish. So always have a strong finish in your story with evidence and facts. A lot of people mess this up, the context, as they provide this big, long, rambling story about the background of the project and all the moving parts and stakeholders, and the story was just about a process you improved. We don't need all of that. So level of detail, and this is really the hardest one to get right, is answers should be around 2 to 4 minutes. Anything longer than like 4.5 minutes is kind of a risk, right? Because you actually have a short amount of time and you have multiple questions, and it's up to you to manage your time. It's not up to the panel to pull you back onto track. You have to manage your time. So if you blow out 6-7 minutes, on one question, you're going to run out of time to do the others.
What happens if the panel don't have time to ask you all the questions? Do they not just mark you for that question at all? Do you lose some points basically if you run out of time?
Yeah, I haven't heard of that happening. I mean, usually I think if the panel was at risk of not completing the questions, they would tell you, right, and pull you back onto track. It probably would depend on their schedule if they've got back-to-back. Usually they have a buffer, to be honest, right? Mm-hmm. They would probably sometimes go into that buffer, but that's not going to be very good, right? You're actually going to be talking over someone's toilet break or coffee break, right? I have heard of panels will sometimes intervene when someone's rambling off track. By the time that happens, I think something's gone pretty wrong, right? Good question. So these are the elements.
Especially, I guess, if they send you questions in advance, you can probably also roughly have an idea how long you need, how much time you need to answer each question. So you probably know that roughly how many questions coming.
Yeah, 100%. And having an good old-fashioned clock, I use this all the time. Something like that, that's not your mobile phone, obviously, is a really good idea. Okay, so these are the basics, right? These are the fundamentals, and we actually want great star stories, not good star stories, right? Because competition is stiff, right? So I've got a whole bunch of these like pro tips, and I would advise if you really want to check out some. I think I've actually done posts on most of these topics here, these 5 things here. For example, how to use notes, how to build a map, definitely. Feel free to message me just directly on LinkedIn if you're looking for any advice, and I can point you to these. These are some pro tips. So pretty straightforward, match the language of the question. So if they talk about working in a multidisciplinary team, you want to use that phrase. So you might change that cross-functional team, you might change that to multidisciplinary team. So it's quite helpful to try and mirror the wording. I'm a big fan of this one, star with 2 R's. It's my own invention. Reflection. So adding a bit more into the end. What were the lessons learned? What would I have done differently? The project was great, but in retrospect, I would have done this a bit differently. Or what maybe changed? If you created a resource or a template or something like that as part of the story, actually we adopted that, for future projects, or just thinking about a reflection that can add really put the icing on the cake.
That's definitely quite often we see it in the private sector. Then you talk about some project and you explain what you did. The interviewer often asks you, what would you do it differently? Or, what's, I guess, what did you learn from that situation as well? They just can't, I guess, answer that when you're in a panel interview. They only going to answer you exactly the question, exact question, but you can anticipate that, they probably want to know that bit as well.
Yeah, and you just reminded me of a really good point, actually, Jana. I mentioned it's not interactive. they don't actually do a lot of follow-up questions usually. They won't usually go back and ask you for further details. Sometimes they'll do a follow-up question on maybe a related topic. But yeah, it's good to have completeness, and this reflection is a good part at the end, I think. The other big one is making a map. I mean, you can do this a bunch of different ways, but basically you want to look at your stories and work out, do I have any gaps, right? So if I got a question about collaboration, what could I use? I got a question about solving a problem, what could I use? I got a question about a continual improvement, where is that covered? You can't go into an interview with 25 stories, right? So you actually need flexibility in your stories. You need to be able to make them fit different question topics. So building a little map of that is a really handy idea. Common mistakes. These are the most common mistakes that I see and coach people on. A lot of people just run with the story they prepped because they dedicated all this time and they memorized some story, and they're not going to change it, no matter what.
And they're going to feed it in any question just because it's a great story, yeah?
Yeah, exactly. So the question was about managing a conflict between stakeholders, and you just ran with your story about managing change and priority with no conflict. This is where that map really helps, and sometimes you may even have to just make up a story on the fly, which you totally can do if you're really well prepped and you know the STAR technique. You can take an episode, quickly think of it, and pad it out. It's much better to do that. Drop the script, drop what you prepped, and go with a story that matches the question. Otherwise, you're just going to fail anyway if you haven't addressed the topic. A lot of people I coach and meet come to me and say, "Oh, I ramble in interviews," and they provide all this detailed background and unnecessary information and jargon and all sorts of things, when you just need to say, "On a project I worked on earlier this year," and then go into your STAR story. So the next one's saying "we" all the time. Now, when you say we had a meeting, all that means is you went to a meeting. Now, in normal life, we always share praise with our teammates, right? And we often use hey, we got the job done. We solved the problem. That's the natural way we'd speak in the office environment, right? Because we share praise with our colleagues. But it doesn't work in interviews. You've got to adopt this way of speaking with strong I statements. Otherwise, you're just not providing evidence of what you did. If you say we had a meeting, we discussed the problem. Covering up gaps is a big one. Now, if you've got this far to an interview, highly competitive, you've probably gone from 100 down to 10 candidates, and you're one of those 10. There are no major gaps. You would not get there if you had a big gap. So when they ask you about something, which includes maybe a gap in your experience, just acknowledge that. No, I haven't had experience supporting Salesforce before. What I do bring to the table is over a decade of experience supporting different CRM products such as XYZ. So position your transferable skills because you already got the interview. It's not an accident. But the worst thing is, I think, is just when people just talk around it. They don't acknowledge the gaps. It's good to just be honest. I don't have this experience, and come up with a strategy to acquire that knowledge. And the other big thing is, yes, you can use notes, but don't just read scripts out. It just comes across really poorly. I think technically speaking, you could do that in junior roles, in entry-level roles, if the script was really spot on. At the end of the day, the panel does want you to give your best possible answer in that session. In that time you've got to give your best answer. But it's pretty rare that your script matches up exactly, and it just doesn't come off very well.
So basically, in terms of that kind of preparation, and I feel like it's a bit different from the private sector. So it's kind of okay to be overly prepared and maybe even sound a little bit scripted, as long as you give that right answer. So because sometimes I guess in the private sector you don't want it to sound too scripted because people think that you just learn your answers by heart. So is it fair?
Yeah, it's a good question. I've just been working with this client over a couple of months now, and he's done so well. He's actually we're on his third interview, and he's actually got offers from the first two. So he's like 2 out of 3 so far, with one to come in, and he sounds quite scripted. That's one of my feedback to him. But I'm like, hey, it's working. You get all the information across. It sounds quite structured, but it is structured because he's prepared and really practiced and put all the elements of the story in. So it's not the worst thing to sound scripted. But yeah, he's not reading in those interviews. It just sounds like he's kind of memorized because his preparation's really good. Again, I think I've forgotten the question you asked, actually, Jana.
That was basically the question. So that's kind of okay sometimes to sound a bit scripted.
It's totally fine. Yeah, if you sound like you're really detailed and it like sounds really well prepared, that's fine. I guess that is different to directly, like literally reading off a script. That's a person that I'm working with who's a technical guy in a technical hands-on role. Perhaps for a senior PM who might be, it may be questioned more if you're relying on that person to lead governance with senior execs and things like that. And that's how you fronted up the whole interview is sort of sounding like you're reading from a script. They might bring into question your communication skills. So yeah, maybe it depends.
Yeah. And I guess it could be a bit challenging sometimes when we're talking about the cultural fit. If everyone sounds a little bit scripted and going with the same questions, how do they assess the cultural fit if you're kind of just trying to script the best answer for the question?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think really what matters, theoretically speaking, the panel can't make decisions based on like the vibe of someone where we think they're going to fit into the existing team. It's about the capabilities. But if there is something more substantial in the culture, for example, we have to deal with ambiguity all the time. So our team are really good at dealing with uncertainty. They go work extra hours to when things come up. That's generally going to be kind of loaded into the selection criteria, anything specific like that. Other than that, that kind of vague cultural fit, which you see all the time, technically shouldn't really be a factor. One of the good things about the public sector is, this whole system of assessment is to not bring biases and discrimination into play, right? Yeah, which is of course at play all the time in private sector, right? You constantly sort of get these feedback loops about cultural fit. Yeah.
Guys, whoever was, feel free to ask some questions. Ben have some sample questions as well to show us. But if you have some burning questions right now, please make sure to post it in the comments. Ben, I'm going to ask you the common question when it comes to government interviews. Is a belief that panel interviews in government are mostly formalities and decision actually already been made. It's already someone in this role, or they already know who they're going to choose. How you can actually predict it or stay motivated to go to those interviews if maybe there is a person there that already been selected?
It's such a good question that you bring up. There are so many times there is an internal candidate already selected by the hiring manager, already preferred, and you're up against that person. You're often up against the person who's already doing the role. And for purposes of their HR and making the role maybe permanent from contract or whatever it is, they have to advertise every role. There are no internal appointments. There are some movements around secondments and expression of interest movements and things like that, but basically every role has to get advertised. And this is the real hard. It's really hard to deal with. You can have the interview of your life. You feel like just nailed it. So well prepared, and it does unfortunately result in some questionable behaviour, where obviously if you're not going to get, you might get unfair feedback or limited feedback. They might mark you as not suitable in one of the questions because they have to, in order to give the role to someone they prefer, right? I feel like anecdotal evidence I've had from exec leaders is there's less of that. Well, let's just say there's more of that in state government, let's say. But it's a constant issue. And when if your goal is to get a public sector role, I mean, just keep applying for lots of roles. Don't wait for that perfect one to come up in that department you really want to work in. And this is difficult for people who want a promotion pathway as well, because often they have to go away from the area which they might be really passionate about to be treated fairly to gain a promotion. Look, it's a reality, and it is hard to stay positive when you really feel like you nailed it and you get some feedback that just doesn't seem right. Sometimes those things are at play.
I actually have some example as well. In one of the consultancy I was working, we have a consultant who already been in the role, and he was interviewing for the same role in the government department to extend the contract, and he actually failed the interview in the role he already was in, and I think that one of the reasons was actually those STAR questions, and he didn't realize that he needed to include in his answers the examples that he's already been doing in that job. So he's been giving examples from his past experience, but the panel doesn't actually understand that he was already, I guess, in that role, and he needed to bring more examples of his actual current role in the government. And not just assume that they know that he's already doing that contract. I have the example of someone who failed interview for their own job. So
I have an example of a client that I coached who was the other person. So she interviewed for a role against the contractor who was acting in that role, and it was going permanent. And she came out on top, and the contractor had to hand over to her when she came in to join the team. So it does happen sort of both ways, I guess, is that theoretically it should be a level playing field and the best person gets the job. That's the idea.
Yeah. So, and I remember when I moved to Australia, I got placed as the government. It was a government program. I got placed to the magistrate court as an admin. And then the role had to go, to the market. And we had I think 300 applicants or something ridiculous, with all this selection criteria. And I didn't even pass to the first round of interviews, even though I was doing already that job. I didn't even get through the, resume screening. So that's a real process in the government. So sometimes you just, never know.
Yeah. And look, and this is for this sort of reason, if you're really serious about a long-term career in government, you may even take a step down, apply for a more junior position to what you've been doing, because you can come through that process as the very top candidate because you're sort of overqualified, perhaps. So that that's actually one thing to consider, that it can work in your favor. And then you have to sort of accept the fact you've got to step down for a couple of years and then build your career back from that point.
We have some questions coming through, Ben, as well. Nishant has a question. Any sign you can suggest if the panel wishes to progress forward or about to reject?
Yeah, good question. I think it's mostly gut feel. I've definitely heard a few comments at the end of, so I had one client who basically got the reference checks triggered about 15 minutes after the interview finished. And they sort of said that in the, like, more or less said, you'll be hearing from us, sort of wink, wink in the interview, but not usually, Rob. And yeah. And also, I know it's kind of tempting on this topic. It's tempting when you get asked at the end, do you have any questions? It's tempting to ask about the process, you know, when will you make a decision, what, blah, blah, blah. But I wouldn't do that. I'd use your time. I know you want to know those things, but you can't change anything, right? Like, you just got to have to wait. And waiting is the name of the game. So if you get that opportunity to ask questions at the end, I'd make them really good questions that actually reflect well on you, rather than going, oh, when are you making a decision? When will I hear back? When's, you know, that's my 2 cents on that one.
Yeah. The Naveen is asking, what could be the interview duration? How many questions are expected? Like, I mean, you already mentioned some of them could be really short, like only 25 minutes. So if it's 25 minutes, like, how many questions they hoping to ask, I guess?
Yeah, probably 4. 4 is usually the minimum kind of level. I think I have come across a 3-question one, but it's probably quite hard for them. Yeah. I'd say 4 is usually the minimum. There's quite a lot more variation in state government than there is in the federal government. The federal government tends to be more quite rigid around, 4 or 5 questions. Those interviews do vary. But yeah, anywhere really from like 25 would be the shortest one through to an hour. You can have hour-long meetings as well, interviews.
Probably never longer than an hour, I guess.
No.
No, is
and seldom more than one. It certainly can happen. They're very diligent about reference checking, credential checking. All of your details have to be right. There's often, even police checks and things like that. And they're very diligent in the CV and key selection criteria screening, because the interviews are so intensive, there's usually only one.
Yep. No. Only one interview in general in the process. Yeah. That's, I guess, one thing to remember as well, that you often have only one shot.
Yeah.
And James has not a question, just saying that if you're the best employee in the department, 10 employees who have been there for 30 years can still feel threatened.
Yeah, I'd say that's a fair observation in that sort of competitive interview process. Your tenure, years of tenure doesn't automatically count for getting a better result through those processes. I've coached a lot of people who've been stuck at certain levels, for a long time. They might have been 7 or 8 years sort of stuck at one level, and they really needed to get out of the department they were in to get a fair go, maybe because there is a bit of, I don't know, stigma there or whatever's going on for them. So often it's a case of having to move out completely to a new department to get a promotion, and then some people move back. They really like working in that area in government.
There you go. The person, I did just a VPS 5 interview yesterday, 1 hour, lots of questions.
Yeah, there's quite a bit of variance in state government. It's very structured in the APS. It does depend on who the hiring manager is too. So if you get a hiring manager, the hiring manager sort of calls the shots really on like what the format is. And particularly too, if they come from the private sector, they can really run it how they want. So you sort of have to know what the structure, like what the traditional structure is, and be ready for that. But you will find definitely that some interviews are just conversational. Absolutely. It really gets sort of, the tone gets set by the hiring manager. And particularly within the state government too, it's very broad. So as long as they sort of run the process in a fair way and there's data recorded, they can kind of call the shots.
What's the VPS 5?
Level 5, equivalent to so that's Victorian Public Service level 5 role. Yeah.
I think it's, also if you're applying for government job, you need to know all those, jargons too, and abbreviations and things.
Yeah.
Few more questions before we wrap up our today's discussion. Amay is asking, is it taken positively usually if you ask if they're preferred candidate who is acting in the role currently? It starts to avoid waste each other time.
Yeah.
Probably not appropriate in the government interview as much.
Look, you can. Often the hiring manager's name and email is attached to the job description. They usually get inundated by calls, but you could actually call them up and ask them that question. I wouldn't probably lead in with it straight away. You want to officially sort of give you a pitch and, hey, just a quick question for you. Do you have any internal candidates who are preferred for the role? And you might find that out. Obviously, if you've got a network of people you could talk to and find out, that might be worthwhile too. But at the end of the day, yes, technically you're probably wasting some time, but you need to be good at writing these applications. You need to be good at interview prepping. And if you're, it's all good practice. I really don't think there's anything you can do about that issue. They certainly are not supposed to say, yes, we've got a preferred candidate. They're not supposed to say that, right? So you have to be really careful with your questioning or just try to get unofficial advice.
Yeah, definitely. I'm cautious about time. Already 51 minutes into our discussion. I don't know, Ben, do you think you can share a sample question just really, really quickly, in 1 minute?
Let me just go through. I've got a rough sort of star story. I haven't actually practiced it much, so it might be a bit too rough. But let me just let's share a couple of questions. So this is a typical BA question, APS 6 level, so pretty senior. So it'd be a senior or sort of lead BA. So tell me about a time when you had a last-minute missed requirement from a stakeholder or a change. How did you work with your stakeholders to accommodate the change? So we need a star story here, but we need to pivot to make sure that we're talking about there's a missed requirement or change. So that's a really key theme our story has to have, right? And then we've got to describe in detail how we would accommodate the change. And that's being really detailed. So I would be saying, I reviewed the feature documentation. I gave a deadline. I ran a meeting with the developer and tester. I documented the business rules. I updated the JIRA ticket. I reprioritized the backlog. Those are the sorts of I statements you want to have in your story. It's quite detailed because they're asking you, how did you work? What was the process you worked through, to accommodate the change? So this is actually, I chose this one because I guess it sort of shows you've got to answer the question. And I know that sounds weird for me to say that, but you've got to actually unpack the exact nature of the question. So they're saying here, what is your experience of working in this way? And how did you manage many relationships with the team and stakeholders? So I would want to describe my experience with multidisciplinary agile teams, right? So I would want to say something like, well, look, over my 10-year career, pretty much all of that time has been working in multidisciplinary agile teams. For example, in my current role, I work with a team of 12 across 3 business units, including An example of how I've managed relationships with the team is, and then you go into a star story. So it's kind of got like 2 parts to it, right? That you have to get right. What's your experience of working this way? And then they want a star story. They want you to give a real detailed example of how you managed multiple relationships. So that would come back to your list of stories and you pick out the best one, right? That's about collaborating with stakeholders, maybe sorting out a conflict or building a new relationship with a stakeholder. And those are super common themes. I think I've got a list of a few common themes just the end of the path.
Yeah, I'm sure everyone who going for the government interview gonna just jump on LinkedIn and connect to Ben. And look on all the tips and the sample question he has on the LinkedIn, and obviously jump on his website to book the session. But Ben, should we choose like one lucky participant who can book the virtual coffee chat with you straight away? While you choosing that lucky participants in the comment, I'm gonna do a quick announcements for what's happening in my world. So obviously a lot of tech walking coming up, and we've been doing a lot of things on the Sunshine Coast and in Melbourne and in Sydney as well. So Sunshine Coast is actually coming up next weekend. That's a wrong date. So it's this Sunday, the 20th of July. It will be tech walk on the Sunshine Coast if you live that way. And then tech walking in Sydney, 26th of July. So if you're in Sydney, make sure to join me. It's our first tech walk in Sydney. So I'm actually looking forward to meeting a lot of you face-to-face, especially if you've been joining my online sessions. So it would be good to meet. And we're actually thinking about bringing it to other states. I'm thinking maybe I'll come to Adelaide, and whatever. Message me. Let's organize more walks. And next week, let me just find my next week. That's not my next week. Next week we're already in July. Oh my God, just too many things happening after holidays. Next week about networking and how to network your way into the hidden job market. So really hot topic at the moment. Obviously, just applying for jobs not always get you a job. So I definitely recommend to join our discussion with Chris with the best practices on networking to uncover those hidden jobs. Ben, who you wanted to connect from our audience today and give more tips, maybe not only on the government interviews, but just interview in general?
Yeah, sure. We can cover different topics. I've chosen somewhat at random, but Amy Kalamkar. Hopefully I'm not butchering your name there, but I'd love to offer a 1-hour coaching session for you. So feel free to just contact me through LinkedIn, and happy to do that.
Perfect. I mean, I'll also make sure that I'll follow up that you're connected to Ben. And thank you again, Ben. It's as usual a great session with so many insights. We definitely have a few thank yous from the audience. Rajan is saying super helpful session, some great points to be mindful on. Thanks, Ben, for your insights. Same great talk from Penny. Thank you, Ben, for joining us again. And I'm sure we'll see you again on this channel in a few months. And guys, there's a lot of exciting things coming up. Keep an eye on my meetup group and obviously LinkedIn profile. There's definitely a few new activities will be coming your way. Anyway, thank you so much, Ben, again, and I'll see everyone next Wednesday.
Thanks, Jana. Bye, everyone.
See you.